the context of the conference has always been to look very far for flavors, but it's also very important to look at home and to look close to home and to look at things that are happening right under our nose and that have been happening here for centuries, if not even longer than that. And that's what this next session will do. We're going to look at Native American traditions and as something that is becoming more and more important to a lot of people. And I think there's a greater realization. There's still a huge amount of work to do, but there's a greater realization of this importance of understanding what started right here in America to understand the world around us too. So to lead us through this session is moderator Jody Eddy, and it's through Jody that I met Sherman, who will be the chef here, and other Native American chefs, because they are both from Minnesota, and there is obviously a strong Native American population there, as Sean will tell us. Jody is a Renaissance woman. She leads culinary tours. She's a writer for publication like Saveur Magazine and Vice, Food and Wine, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, et cetera. She writes cookbooks that take her all around the world, too. The one she's working on right now, and that she'll love to tell you about because it leads to really amazing adventures, is on monastery food. So she's traveling all over, visiting monks and nuns and researching their foods and writing about that. She also consults for NGOs and does a lot of other things. She was the IACP's Judge Choice Award for her cookbook North, the New Nordic Cuisine of Iceland, where she has also spent a lot of time, et cetera, et cetera. I could just keep going, but I want you to hear from Jody directly and then from Sean also. So please welcome Jody Eddy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I, as well as Ruth, am very surprised at the turnout in this early hour of the morning. I am really thrilled and honored today to introduce my friend, Sean Sherman. Sean and I met years ago at a conference in the Sonora Desert in Arizona, and he has always been very transparent, open, honest with me about a lot of conversations I think that are very difficult to have, and he's really moving the conversation forward. Sean is the founder and CEO of the Sioux Chef. He's a Lakota from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. He's been cooking throughout the U.S. and Mexico for over 30 years. And in that time, his accomplishments are myriad. They're countless. He served the first decolonized dinner at the James Beard House recently in New York City. His cookbook that was just published this year, The Sioux Chef, was recently nominated for a James Beard Award. Sean will be signing that later today, and I highly recommend it. He's also a recent recipient of the Bush Fellowship, an incredible accomplishment, and I'm really thrilled to see where that takes him. Sean and I share a home state of Minnesota, so call out to the Midwest. I've learned incredible things from him about indigenous techniques, ingredients, philosophies, about why his mission to decolonize the native diet is so critical. And I've also learned from him about how he's going about revitalizing native foodways. And he'll talk all about that today. I know he has a really vast, thought-provoking presentation. And I think these terms are words that we may not understand, but that it's vital for us to explore. Another thing that Sean and I have talked so much about, and I think is so important for us to always consider in our kitchens as writers, is cultural appropriation and what this means and why it is so critical for us to understand it. And I know Sean will be discussing that as well today. These conversations can be uncomfortable and overwhelming, but Sean has really held my hand through them, and he's taught me that we have to begin somewhere, and this is what we're going to be doing today. And I really encourage you to reach out to Sean. He's very open, transparent, and and I'm just so thrilled and honored today to introduce Sean. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. So I prepared a little bit of a dish of something really simple. It's called wasna. It's something that I grew up with. It's dried meat with the fat that's rendered down. It's mixed with berries. I mixed this with puffed wild rice and amaranth and some wild harvested greens. We picked some miner's lettuce and some wild fennel yesterday, right around campus, basically. Don't tell the lawnskeepers, but but you know, really, what I really want to talk about is just our perspective with Indigenous foods, and where we are today, and why aren't there Native American restaurants all over the place? Because no matter where you are in the U.S., North America's history begins with Indigenous histories, and it's really silly to think that there's just no Native American presence out there. And that's kind of what started me on this journey, because as a chef, I'd been studying so many other cuisines from around the world, as a lot of chefs do. You know, you learn a lot of French technique, you learn about Italian and Mediterranean foods, you learn about, Southeast Asian, Japanese, you learn a bunch of stuff. And then all of a sudden, for me growing up, having grown up on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, it was all of a sudden apparent that, I could walk around the city and find food from all over the world, but nothing that talked about the land and the history of the area I was standing on, which was pretty much everywhere. So it just kind of got me on that path as to, like, where are all of those Native American restaurants, right? So I just wanted to try to fully understand, like, what was going on, because I grew up on the reservation. I was thinking about the foods that I grew up with. And a lot of it had been influenced by government stuff, by the U.S. and European influences. So I wanted to find out what was out there. I couldn't just go online and order Joy of Native American Cooking. So I had to really try to dig deep, So I was looking at all sorts of stuff and just trying to understand, like, why aren't there Indigenous foods out there, to the point where we have opened up our business called the Sioux Chef, and our focus is on pre-colonial foods. So what is pre-colonial foods? For us, it's just like, what were people eating here before European influence? What were those ingredients? Like, what were so for me, this is the food of my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was 18 during the Battle of Little Bighorn with the Lakota, and that's not a long time ago. That's in the late 1800s. And so for me, this was just going back a couple of generations in my own family to try to understand, like, what was my ancestry eating back then? So to understand what pre-colonial is, first off, just to get everybody on the same page, like, what is colonialism? The easiest way to understand colonialism, Google. The policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So we see this happen in history a lot, right? We see a heavily coming out of Europe during the age of exploration. And we see, basically going all around the world: Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, the Americas. All of this area is being affected by European colonialism. People are getting pushed around, people are getting delocated, all sorts of bad things are happening. But then we look at U.S. colonialism, which is something very recent and people don't understand. So at the beginning of our country, in the late 1700s, still over 80% of the entire part of the land was still under indigenous control at that point in time. So Native American history isn't something that's ancient history, right? It's very recent. So again, this is just the era of my great-grandfather. So you'll see how fast that the U.S. government starts to push to take over indigenous people's lands. And it happens really fast, and especially after Civil War. So basically between the years of 1840 and 1870, almost all of the land is taken over, and during that time the same thing is happening. People are being dislocated, they're getting pushed around, people are getting pushed into Oklahoma, entire families are getting wiped out. All of these farming communities, seeds are disappearing from these, all this farming that's happening on the eastern side of the United States, and it happens really, really fast. So for me, it was just kind of an eye-opener to think about, like, how recent this is and how little people don't understand our own histories, right? Because, I mean, if all you read about in history is from your high school textbooks, you're going to have a very skewed sense of American history, since, it was written by the U.S. government. So at the end of the 1800s, we have very little of any control of our lands left. So we lost a lot of things during that time period. So we're kind of in the sense of kind of traumatic healing at this point. We're barely getting to the point of healing. We just went through a very traumatic time period and a very recent time period too. So for us, like, how was this happening? And a big part of this for the U.S. government was declaring war on our foods. So they were burning crops on the East Coast. They were taking out food stores. In the West, they were wiping out bison, you know, anything like camas. They were just taking out all sorts of food because once you destroyed food from somebody, they're easier to subdue. And the U.S. government found that out and was able to utilize this system over and over. And the thing that really sealed the deal of why we don't have a lot of indigenous restaurants out there and people don't know a lot about it was because the next thing that they kind of waged war on was our knowledge. So thousands of years of generational knowledge of things that had been passed down about how to live within your environment utilizing only plants and animals is wiped away during this time period. So when they started the boarding school systems in the late 1800s, all of that generational knowledge comes to a screeching halt because these native children who should be learning their traditions and their ways are forced to not speak their language, not to learn their songs, not to learn how to forage, not to learn how to farm, not to learn how to hunt, and taught how to do carpentry, how to be housemates, household servants, and how to only speak English. And it was really destructive. And boarding schools popped up all over the U.S. during the 1800s. So it really destroyed a lot of the indigenous cultures that were here before. And this is a big part of why there isn't these indigenous people, or not indigenous peoples, but indigenous knowledge. So it's really important just to understand the basic history because it's our history and we have to understand it to be able to move forward, right? So growing up in post-colonial Native America, people are always asking me, like, what did you eat growing up? Where, they want to have this kind of, fantastic thing where I was running around in the forest with some homemade clothes and shooting a rabbit with a bow and arrow I made and stuff like that, right? But, this is what my pantry looked like growing up. And this is, the commodity food program list. And it looks actually much better than it did when I was growing up because we just had black and white cans that just said beans and, stuff like this. But the problem with this program is that it's destructive because it was never meant to be a nutritional program. And so the government starts it in the 1930s as a farm supplement program to help out farmers. And so these foods go to hospitals, schools, and Native American reservations. So the problem with this is that it's high glycemic, there's lots of sodium and bad salts, there's bad fats, there's bad sugars, like you name it. And that's why you see an immense amount of problems on indigenous communities. There's like upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes, there's lots of obesity, there's heart disease, there's all sorts of horrible statistics out there because a lot of people are surviving off of this government reliance food. So for us, we wanted to figure out more, and it wasn't even these fresh vegetables in front. It's just that stuff in the back, right? And the other piece was Indian tacos. So people think about Native American food, and they think, oh, native tacos, it's awesome. Navajo tacos, Indian tacos, whatever you want to call it, fry bread tacos. But when you start decolonizing this plate and getting rid of stuff, like fry bread goes away right away because fry bread was something that the U.S. government gave Native American people because we didn't have wheat flour. So, when you get staples of wheat, lard, salt, sugar, there's not much you can do with it, especially when you don't even have an oven. So the simplest thing you can do is make a simple dough, fry it up in a pan, and it's something that we've seen the U.S. cavalry and military utilizing for a long time. So it became oppression food for indigenous peoples, and there's just absolutely no reason because of how much diversity we have out there that Indian taco should represent every single Native American person across the U.S. Because I always thought it was weird growing up in Pine Ridge in South Dakota and be like, it's weird that our native food tastes like Mexican food, So as a chef, I start looking into it deeper and you try to start figuring out. So I started asking myself, what is an indigenous food system? And to understand indigenous food systems, you have to understand like how much plant diversity we have out there and region diversity and terrain and terroir and everything like that. So there's forests, there's mountains, there's everything. And then you layer on the indigenous people. So there's still 634 tribes in Canada, 567 in the U.S. 1/5 of Mexico is still indigenous and speaks an indigenous language, right? And then the easier way to understand indigenous borders is you look at a language map. So if you see a language map of the U.S. of indigenous languages, the U.S. looks extremely diverse. So if you can imagine like driving across the country and stopping at Native American restaurants, it would change in flavor and culture and mythology and history everywhere you stopped. And but now we have the same exact burger chain and everything across the way. It's so homogenous, and we should be celebrating this immense amount of diversity in culture and tradition and history that we have across the board. So this is kind of the push that we're doing, is trying to showcase diversity out there. And for us, it was more than just culinary. It was about understanding wild foods, permaculture, native agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, salt, sugar, fat production, indigenous crafting, cooking techniques, regional indigenous histories, indigenous traditional medicine, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality. All those things took a play into what is indigenous foods, right? So for the biggest piece for us was reconnecting with the earth around us, like getting to know the plants, like not being lazy and calling everything a weed if you don't know what it is, because indigenous peoples knew the name of all of the plants right around us, right? So when you start learning the names of plants, you start to realize their purpose. Everything has a purpose out there, except for ticks. Everything else has a purpose out there. So ticks are horrible. But anyways, you know, you just see food everywhere, and people are always worried about poisonous foods and things like that, but a lot of those poisonous foods were just really strong medicines. Like, if people knew how to utilize them, you can really use them for your benefit, because, for, again, indigenous peoples around the world shared the commonality of being able to utilize only plants and animals to live sustainably within their area, right? So much knowledge that we should be utilizing right around us. Like, the first thing I did when I was here was take my chef, and we just crawled up the hillside in the back of this castle thing, and just started, like, you know, gathering food, because there's all sorts of cool things out there, and we'll be utilizing those foods on our plates all weekend, this whole week. So, and it's thinking about staples. Like, I grew up with things like timsala, which is a wild prairie turnip. You have things like camas, that was out of the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. We have staples like wild rice, where people are still harvesting today sustainably using no petroleum. They're just using canoes. They're using sticks. And it's something that we have so much, you know. And we have to be careful, because we've ruined over half of this wild rice land, because wild rice used to go as far east as New York State. And basically we have it maybe as far east as Michigan at this point, because there's reclamation efforts out there trying to protect it. And you see a lot of people trying to protect these natural resources because they're important. It's completely different than the California wild rice that you see, because that black wild rice that you see in a rice-a-roni box is something that was designed to be cultivated into you know, big patties, and they can use machinery and combines and stuff. But the real hand-harvested wild rice is something so unique, and it's just this grass seed that just has so much nutrition, and it's such a wonderful staple where we're at. And it's been making families happy for such a long time. We have maple syrup, maple sugars, things like that. Even if you're in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, if you know how to utilize them like the indigenous peoples do, all you see is health and medicine, like, all around you. So there should be no such word as food desert, because the deserts are ripe with food if you know how to look for them. When I think of food desert, I think of, like, one of the suburbs around Minneapolis, but you know, if you're on the coastal, like, I'm jealous of the coastal tribes, because they have, like, this whole other food system right offshore. So not only did you have inland, but you have coastal. So you have plants, you have animals, you have shellfish, you have all sorts of stuff to utilize. Indigenous peoples knew how to do that, because they were resourceful with everything that was around them. And there's so much health and medicine out there, and food. So you just have to know how to utilize it and identify it. Like, again, like, we're so lazy as Americans because we call everything weeds, right? And it's unfortunate that our kids know the names of more Kardashians than they do trees, right? That's our fault. We should be teaching them what's important, you know? So the other piece to look at is indigenous agriculture, because it has this huge history. A lot of people know about a Three Sisters situation where there's corns and beans and squash. You grow the corn, the beans crawl up the beans crawl up the corn, and the squash covers the ground area, right? And this is more of an eastern, but because we're such a huge area, and agriculture spreads in such a large spot, because agriculture starts in southern Mexico with corn culture in particular, and it's followed by corns, beans, squash, sunflower seeds, chilies, and we see these same crops crawl most of the way. Like, chilies kind of stop in the southwest, but throughout the entire eastern seaboard, up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, like where I grew up in South Dakota, people have been farming in those regions for over 2,000 years, and there's so much awesome diversity out there. Even like when the Spanish were first coming into Mexico, they were seeing what they called floating gardens, but they were these awesome raised beds, and it was a beautiful agricultural system that nobody's really utilizing today. The people in the desert were able to grow out agriculture and have it flourish, and that's a huge human feat to be able to do this in the desert, you know, at high heat, drought-resistant seeds. People all the way up in my area in the Dakotas, you see the same crops all over. So there's so much history, and we're lucky to have any of that diversity left, because a lot of it went away when the westward expansion was happening and seeds were being destroyed. A lot of those farming communities were being completely destroyed. So you have crops of beans, you have squash. And then you think about indigenous food techniques, so the nixtamalization of corn followed that agriculture wherever it went. So processing corn into hominy or pozole or whichever part of the country you might be in, but it was just something as simple as making an alkaline water bath utilizing only wood ash and then processing the corn. And when you process corn in that manner, then you are able to get all of the benefits from corn: calcium, potassium, magnesium, iron, zinc. And it's just a much easier way. So when you look at Mexican cuisine is way more indigenous than it is Spanish influence. So if you decolonize it, you still have mostly Mexican cuisine because you have nixtamalized corns, you have chilies, you got tomatoes, you've got all this stuff. So like for us, like we've removed all European ingredients. So there's no dairy, no wheat flour, no processed sugar, no beef, no pork, no chicken. So like Mexican cuisine, you get rid of sour cream, you get rid of cheese, you get rid of cilantro even, stuff like that. You still have really strong Mexican roots there with the food. So it's a great place to look at. Food preservation techniques, drying foods out. For us as chefs, like saving seeds to make sure, like when we're using these special heirloom varietals, we're making sure to save those seeds and get them back into the hands of farmers. Because up until the 1800s for indigenous peoples, they didn't have to pay for food because they took care of their own food, right? And if you can control your food, you can control your destiny. So that's what we're just trying to get people. That's the strongest sense about food sovereignty is like if you can control your food, then you can control who you are and the people who you are, not be reliant on government foods that are only making you sick. So for us, it was trying to figure out what to do with this. So we started our business. We started hiring young native chefs. We started training them to be a part of this as an everyday thing, as part of our culinary practices, getting to know the plants, seeing food everywhere, utilizing technology and information to help us along, like not trying to do a timepiece and cook like it's 1491, but to take all that generational knowledge that we're relearning and apply it to today to do something bigger with it. Right? Making our own pantry items, grounding our own flours, using our own herbs. We don't have to follow a simple, French-influenced cookbook. We can utilize all of the stuff that makes food taste like where we are. This picture is rabbit, cedar, wild rice, cranberry, maple. You can see all those ingredients standing in one spot, one lake in Minnesota. So it's making food taste like where we were and having fun with it, putting artistry on it, right? We can make food beautiful because the food is beautiful, and humans, that's something we all share as food. Making businesses that were serving only indigenous ingredients and doing it really for the indigenous communities. That was really our passion. So this work was always bigger than me. It wasn't about trying to create a name for myself. It was about just trying to get this knowledge out there and to share it. So for our vision, we knew opening a restaurant would literally lock ourselves in a box because restaurants are actually the worst business plan you can come up with, But they're important because one restaurant can really change an entire community. So we developed a nonprofit called NATIVS, or North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where we have this grand vision to reteach indigenous foodways and education and to create food access. And it's kind of taking those two fronts that colonialism had against us by returning indigenous knowledge and returning our indigenous foods to the people that matters the most. So we created a brand called the Indigenous Food Lab, where we're starting off in Minneapolis because that's where we're based off. But the Indigenous Food Lab is going to be a restaurant and a training center that's going to teach about, a classroom to teach about all of this indigenous food knowledge that we have, and also to have this restaurant to train people how to work with it, and to create lots of curriculum around it, and utilizing the cookbook we just came out with as an educational tool because it has over 100 recipes using only indigenous ingredients and all the philosophy wrapped into it. Our next phase is to work with tribes around us and help them to develop their own food business to create that food access in those communities that need it. Help them create community gardens, help them permaculture design and just landscape with purpose. We should just be putting food everywhere. Lawns are stupid. You don't need lawns. You should be putting food everywhere. That's how we're going to feed everybody in the future, right? And then eventually we want to open up, thanks. Eventually, we want to open up indigenous food labs all across North America to really revitalize that indigenous knowledge that we've been so blind to for so long because it's right under our feet constantly. So for us, this was an indigenous food evolution and revolution all at the same time. It's breaking past all that oppression and moving forward. So for us, it's all about these next generations. It's about these next kids who can grow up knowing what their foods are because they're the ones that are going to be leaders. And indigenous peoples have always been stewards of the landscape that we've lived in. They've overseen these lands for, long generations, and we've destroyed so many indigenous lives over this time period, this very short time period. So it's time that we give some respect and some knowledge back to this traditional knowledge, right? California has a horrible history where they had a bounty system between 1850 and 1860 where you can make $25 to bring in the head of an indigenous person. And $25 in 1850 is like $800 when the cost of living is 25 cents. So California itself wiped out almost 90% of its indigenous population back during that one stretch of 10 years, right? It's horrible. So for us, we want to give back a model to people utilize all around the world to reclaim indigenous knowledge and to revitalize it, because indigenous cultures all around the world hold so much strength in the knowledge of how to live sustainably within the land. So we just ask people to learn the indigenous histories of your regions, connect with and learn the plants directly around you, respect the efforts to support protecting our natural resources, because they're very important. This is our food, this is our land, and what we do to the land is going to affect us or affect our next generation one way or the other. Support indigenous food producers, because we're trying to create a lot of economic demand for them. And be aware of appropriation. And just a simple form of appropriation is just instances of a dominant culture profiting from the customs and cultures of a non-dominant culture without the occurrence of any benefits to the non-dominant culture. So just be really careful is all, because the last thing Native Americans want is for European chefs to tell them how to cook indigenous foods, right? But people should celebrate the indigenous foods and be aware of it, because we should all be celebrating food no matter what. We want everybody to enjoy. We just want people to be very careful, because there's a lot of damage in our history and there's a lot of repair and a healing that needs to be done, but we have to start somewhere. So. What's that? What? Oh, I did in the beginning. Yeah. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it. So we'll have more foods out. We did this dish, but unfortunately nobody gets to try it. But we'll be out for lunch, and we have some foods tomorrow, and we'll do a book signing tomorrow too. So please come see us. Thank you very much.
Sean, I think the standing ovation speaks for itself, and I'm so happy to hear how you guys are hearing Sean's message, and it's probably one of the most important takeaways of this conference. And so thank you for being receptive. Thank you to Sean for being so powerful and so striking and so important. Thank you, Jody, for making this happen. We are now going on breaks, and as you know...